Hi, Teddy.
I'm Ted.
We use yet another platform. It's our third one, right?
Yes, and if we may get a fourth if we do the education thing in September.
All right. Round them all out. The worst part is if you use different devices, then you have to remember to install all the different pieces, all the devices.
No installation necessary for the one we'll use.
Made it easy. Let's see, looks like it's 10 a.m. Sonia on?
Sorry about that. Yep, I'm here.
Okay, perfect. All right, Sonia, so do we want to go ahead and do a roll call? See who's on, and then.
Yeah, I'm going to be multitasking here, letting people into the meeting. So I sound distracted. That's why that is. Okay. Let's see. Okay. Teddy Backelli.
I am here.
Okay. Yvonne Caraval. I don't think I saw Yvonne yet. Nolan Coffin. I don't believe I saw Nolan sign on yet. Dale Cook. I don't see him as well. Steve Fensky. Let's see, Steve Georgie.
Here.
Excellent, thank you. Jason Holliday, I know, has a conflict, so he will not be in attendance. Mark Johnson.
I'm here. Good morning.
Excellent. Good morning. Bernadine Jocelyn.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning. Brian Ranvier.
I'm here. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning. Micah Myers.
Here.
Good morning. Teresa Sundee.
I'm here. Good morning.
Good morning. Just checking to see who else is in the waiting room. There we go. Jim Wakeham.
Morning.
Good morning. Paul Wirtz.
Morning.
Oh, I've lost Sonia.
Sure.
Give her a minute, see if she can. Oh, there we go.
This is Sonia. I'm having some connection issues. Am I back?
Yeah, you are back. I can see you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sure.
Oh,
Sure.
please, thank you. So let's see here. All right. sorry, I'm gonna.
Yeah.
Just want to make sure no one else is waiting in the waiting room. Yeah. People joining us. Okay.
Yeah.
Dave, are you here?
Good morning, everyone. I am here.
Excellent. Okay, I believe I saw
Yeah.
Yvonne sign on.
She waved, but we couldn't hear her.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Excellent.
Here, I'm here.
Good morning.
Okay.
Looks like I just got an email from Nolan, so he's not here. And then I'm just looking through the others. Doesn't look like Dale or Stefanski have come on since.
Looks like Dale would be on. I see his name on the screen.
Dale, I see you now, Dale. Sorry about that. My apologies.
Okay, so I think we've hit everyone. Well, thank you, Sonia, for going through that. And it's always challenging when we switch over to a new platform. So everybody, it's good to have a little patience with this. So a little bit of an agenda today. We did sort of the roll call. In a minute, I'll also let others announce themselves if they would like to. We'll approve the minutes from the last meeting. And then first item agenda is an update from the Office of Broadband Development. So Angie and Diane will give us an update, a little bit about the kind of where the final kind of discussion on where the funding landed, as well as some of the activities happening at the Office of Broadband Development. And then at 10:15, we will have the Minnesota Department of Transportation to come in and talk about fiber optic partnerships and the study done there. I'm pretty excited to hear about that. I think some of the efforts that are happening with the Department of Transportation really kind of speak to what availability of broadband can do beyond just having it to the home, but other productive activities. Yeah. So hopefully, lots of you. There's a lot of good information we will gain from there, as well as we'll have an opportunity to ask some good questions. When they're done with their presentation, we'll take a break. At the moment, we've got a 5-minute break scheduled. However, depending on if we end early or whatnot, we will adjust that accordingly. Sure. When we come back from break, we have CNS broadband update of the map. So we'll have
Sure.
Paul from Cooperative.
Well, first of all, Ron, thank you for the feedback and the transparency.
We have pace. There we go. Thank you, Sonia. And then we should be done with that around 11:50, and then we will do a round of subgroup updates. It will be kind of short today, 10 to 15 minutes. However, probably be the last one that will be this short. We'll do more expansive discussions on the subgroups going forward. And then we'll open up to any public comments or any other business that we may have for the day. So that's the agenda. We have, as far as kind of a face-to-face meeting, I would love to have that sooner than later, but it doesn't sound like we're progressing in the right direction with infections and things like that. So more to come. I'll have more discussions with with Diane and Angie, and as we do the planning, and then if it makes sense, hopefully we can get together sooner than later. I know when we do the event, Mark, with you, hopefully we'll be face to face. So that would be that was the whole point of doing that. So hopefully get a chance to do that. So I'm excited about that as well. So with that, before we kind of get into the meat of the discussion or the topics for the day, is there anybody else outside of the individuals on the task force that would like to announce themselves at this moment in time? If so, just come off mute and say who you are. I'll give it a minute, and then we'll continue.
Hi, Scott Cole from Collectivity and Connected Minnesota.
Good morning, Scott.
Anna Boroff with the Cable Association. Good morning.
Good morning, Anna.
Good morning, Brent Christensen with the Telecom Association.
Good morning, Brent.
Good morning, Jessica O with MnDOT. I'm our Strategic Partnerships Director in the Sustainability and Public Health team.
Good morning, Jessica.
Good morning,
Hi, Chuck Ackman. I'm on Senator Klobuchar's staff.
Good morning, Chuck.
And Bree Mackey with Senator Smith. Sorry to double up there on our intros.
No, no worries. Good morning, Bree.
Morgan Putnam, MGI Consulting, here via invitation from MnDOT.
Good morning, Morgan. See ya.
Morning, Paul Selsrud, CNS.
Morning, Paul.
Amanda Dewar, Charter Communications.
Morning, Amanda.
Good morning. This is Kristen Webb with the Minnesota Office of Connected and Automated Vehicles. Thank you for having us here today.
Good morning, Kristen. Look forward to your presentation soon. Okay, I believe we've captured everyone. Okay, next is the approval of the minutes from our last meeting. That was included in the meeting invite today, as well as an email from Sonia. I hope everybody had a chance to review those minutes. Does anybody have any comments or questions or concerns about the minutes from our last meeting? Okay, I'm not hearing anything and I'm not seeing any hands up or comments in the chat, so assume the minutes are approved and they will be posted for the general public. Okay, so with that, we can switch over to the update from the Office of Broadband Development. Angie, I will turn it over to you.
Good morning, everyone. We're happy to be here with you today. Diane is going to give the update, and then we're happy to answer any questions. Diane?
Great, thanks, Angie. I did want to note, I think I saw Nolan Cowden join from the task force. Yes, he waved his fingers. So I just wanted to make note of that. So for the update from the office, as you probably all know, the Border to Border grant program was funded. This task force last met on June 14th, and the broadband funding was in a bill that was passed on June 29th and signed by the governor on June 30th. It is a law that would fund the Border to Border broadband infrastructure grant program at $70 million over the next 2 fiscal years. And the funding is from the American Rescue Plan Act, Section 604, Capital Projects Fund. The language in the law directs the Commissioner of Deed to submit an application to Treasury requesting the $70 million from Minnesota's Capital Projects Fund allocation. And as we understand that Section 604, there's a formula for allocating funding to the states and territories. And so the Commissioner of Deed is supposed to submit an application. And that application is to be submitted by September 30th of 2021 or 90 days after Treasury begins accepting applications for the capital projects funding. As you know, in the past, the Border to Border grant program has been funded with budget surplus funding, but from state general revenue funds. And so it's totally within state control. And then we have been able to move forward with our grant application immediately upon approval of the legislation. Unfortunately, we aren't able to do that this year because Treasury has not yet issued guidance on the criteria for using that funding, how it will distribute the funding, or when it will open the application period. We are monitoring Treasury site closely and hope to be able to open the next grant round yet in 2021, but that remains uncertain. The last thing I'm seeing posted on their site is from May. So we're waiting and checking the site daily. We will use the list of people that have signed up for information on broadband on the Contact Us section of our website to keep people informed of when we're going to be able to open up the application window. So that's the update on the grant program. There is another law change that took place with the electric co-ops, and that language in statute was amended to allow an electric co-op to use its current electric transmission or distribution
Recording in progress.
easements for broadband infrastructure and for deploying broadband service after notice to property owners. And that was something I think this task force had discussed while that was pending. And we had last fall, we had a panel discussion between cable and rural electrics on that, but that law did get through. One other update from the office is that, as you know, DEED's Small Cities program had a coronavirus CDBG-CV grant program where they were accepting applications in, I believe it was May. It's our understanding that they should be announcing in the near future approximately $25.5 million for broadband deployment grants being made with HUD funding from the CARES Act. We did not have a role in determining the criteria for this grant program, and we did not review the grant applications at OBD. It is our understanding that HUD CDBG funding is generally directed to low and moderate income areas, so we would expect that to be a prominent factor for the Small Cities Group to determine which applications are funded. And then lastly, there has actually been some movement at the FCC on the RDOF. On July 26th, which was Monday, the FCC took some steps in the RDOF proceeding. They did approve 48 winning bidders and over $311 million in funding across 36 states to receive RDOF fund support. So those long forms were approved. The next step is for those RDOF winners to submit bank letters of credit by August 9th. And included in the list were 2 Minnesota winning bidders, Consolidated Communications for 12 locations or about $11,000 over the 10 years. And that's the Consolidated that operates in the Mankato area. And then Farmers Mutual, one of our co-ops, for 232 locations and about $760,000 over the next 10 years. As you may recall, there was also some issues raised with the RDOF about some of the census blocks that were eligible to receive support being in parking lots or not having any people in them or already being served. So the FCC also took some steps in their order to try to clean that up by offering winning bidders an opportunity to withdraw their funding requests for already served blocks or where blocks were raised with issues of waste being identified. The FCC also denied requests by a company called AB Indiana in the state of Florida and LTD Broadband for California, Oklahoma, and Kansas, where they had requested an extension of the deadline for receiving state ETC designation. The FCC found that those companies did not seek state certification in a timely manner. So those companies are in default in those states. LTD also has requests for extensions to receive their state ETC certification in the states of Iowa, Nebraska, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Texas. And the FCC said they will rule on those requests at a later time. And just as background, overall, LTD, as you recall, was the largest winner in RDOF. They won $1.3 billion to serve 528,000 locations in 15 states. So where they're in default, it's for 187.5 million in about 77,000 locations in California, 3.2 million in about 2,100 locations in Kansas, and 81 million and just under 40,000 locations in Oklahoma. So those areas that are in default will be eligible for federal funding and RDOF 2. There were also some winning bidders that decided not to pursue receipt of the RDOF funding, and that included Aspire Networks in Minnesota. I think that was the consortium of AEG and Heron in some of the documents announcing the winning bidders back in December. They were scheduled to receive $6.7 million to serve 115 locations in the state, and those locations all look to be in Lake County. So they'll be in default, and those census blocks will be eligible for other federal funding and or included in RDOF 2. And as you may recall, 2 U.S. senators had requested an update from the FCC on what was taking so long for them to act on the RDOF long forms. And so I suspect Monday's action was likely prompted to help the agency in its reply because the senators wanted a letter from the FCC by July 29th. And then related to that, you probably also heard that the FCC, NTIA, and USDA have agreed to share information on their federal funding decisions amongst each other so that the agencies have the necessary information from each other so there isn't duplication of federal funding to overlapping areas. So I think that also is going to help the FCC act a little bit quicker on these RDOF. But it's good to see that initial movement from them. So I think I'll stop there and see if there's any questions.
Any questions for Diane? Lots of good updates there.
Diane, is there a good chance that with this federal grant that the state could get, that could get delayed for a grant round into next year?
Paul, yes, I believe that's a strong possibility since Sunday is August 1st and the Treasury hasn't even issued the guidance. And so then there's also got to be an application period, and the law states that we're supposed to apply by September or 90 days after that window opens, and we're not even seeing a window at this point. So yeah, we're definitely worried about skipping over 2021 and not having a grant round this year.
If we get the money, are there extra strings attached? Well, there are always strings attached with the feds, but in terms of running the Minnesota Broadband Grant Program and the criteria, is there anything that would, kind of hurt that or delay that or add some hurdles in that for grant applicants?
Yes, unfortunately, the law that was passed in Minnesota that requires the funding to come from the capital projects funding does give the office some leeway so that, we're not stuck trying to follow state law when there's other requirements in federal law. So with this funding, we'll have some flexibility, and those are some of the things that we're going to have to figure out once we actually see the guidance from Treasury. Whether there are modifications we need to make to our program. There could be areas that the federal language says we're supposed to prioritize or avoid. So yeah, those are things we will factor into our application and the process after we know what they are.
And just to follow up on that, and maybe Angie as well, is there anything this task force can do to help with sort of, or is it just sort of we just wait and see kind of what Treasury does?
Probably wait and see. I mean, there are a lot of states kind of chomping at the bit for this, and everybody wanted broadband yesterday. But we already know that this funding it's going to be carried out over years to get broadband built with the federal funding.
Other questions or comments from anyone else? Okay. Thank you for that update, Diane. That was good.
Thank you.
So for this task, good progress. We got some funding, although it seems like it's not as fast as we'd like it to be. And then also some of the rulings on the electric co-ops. That was some of the recommendations we had. So despite that, we know not all our recommendations come to life. At least it's good to see that we continue to push, and there are some things that do move us forward. So that's encouraging, and so continuing to do the work and putting forward the right recommendations with the right backup information, and then continuing to push with letters and encouragements certainly helps. So it was good to see that. Okay, so let's switch to the next topic. So we will go to the Connecting Minnesota, and it's the Department of Transportation for Minnesota, MnDOT. We'll talk about the fiber optic partnership study, and I think Kristen White, I believe you're on. So welcome, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, members of the Broadband Task Force. My name is Kristen White, as was noted, and I'm really actually very excited to be here today because your colleagues at the Office of Broadband Development and partners across the state, including task force members Bernadine and Jocelyn, have been wonderful contributors to this project that I plan to update you on. So I am just going to share my screen, and I might ask Sonia just to confirm in your moment whether or not you can see a slide entitled Connecting Minnesota.
We got it, thanks.
Excellent, thank you. So everyone, I am going to try and monitor the chat box as we're meeting today. If I miss anything, we will have plenty of time to discuss your questions, feedback, and ideas at the conclusion of the slide deck presentation. But before I dive into this project, I wanted to share a little bit about our office and program, as many of you are probably asking, what on earth are connected and automated vehicles? I didn't even know we had a state office, and what does that have to do with broadband? And so today I want to talk a little bit about my team and my program and our vision and why it's directly connected to broadband infrastructure and the future of Minnesota. So the Minnesota CAVEX office is a 3-year-old office that was established in 2018 with the goal to innovate and explore new technologies to see how they can advance Minnesota goals as far as safety, equity, mobility, and sustainability. And our program and staff of 10 focuses in these 6 key areas, many of which you in the Broadband Task Force are already involved in a wide variety of topics. And I have to say that I'm very happy to be here today because, as you may well know, your former chair, Margaret Anderson Kelleher, is our commissioner and a vast advocate for connected and automated technologies to understand how they can support Minnesota communities. Margaret Anderson Kelleher chairs the Governor's Advisory Council on Connected and Automated Vehicles, another appointed body very similar to yours that sets the statewide vision for where we go as we are trying to plan and prepare for these emerging technologies. Their vision is to understand how we can leverage these technologies to build a transportation system that's safe, efficient, healthy, and sustainable. And they do that in 3 key ways: to collaborate with stakeholders like yourselves and your networks, to partner with the private industry and academic institutions and research, and third, and foundationally, to engage Minnesota communities so they are armed with information to be decision makers that have information to help us inform our policy and work. The state's CAV goals go well beyond transportation because we're trying to look at it from a systems approach. So the goals set by the Governor's Advisory Council include something very important for all of us today is advancing equity, access to transportation and mobility. As our mobility advocates remind us, over 80% of Minnesotans are unemployed that have disabilities because of a direct lack of affordable, reliable transportation. And we believe that technologies like automation can help solve that gap. But we also recognize that in many industries, automation has concerns about displacing workers. So we're working with other participants indeed to understand how we can upskill and reskill the workforce of tomorrow to be prepared and armed to be leaders in this technology change. Third, as you can imagine from a transportation organization, we're very excited to see how these technologies can reduce the number of fatalities on our roads here in Minnesota, as 94% of the nation's collisions have some form of element of human error. So if automation and machines can reduce the opportunity for us to be distracted or intoxicated, we believe we should plan and prepare for those futures. Of course, very important to DEED and the Broadband Task Force, we believe that these types of technologies and the industry innovation can help grow our economy locally and nationally, as well as grow small businesses that are really important to our communities. We also are challenged, and this will be a topic of conversation today, to understand how we can build a system, whether it's broadband, fiber, or even roads, to be able to be more nimble and flexible for an unknown future of tomorrow, as many things are changing. And over the past 100 years, as you see behind me, a 1933 highway road plan, things have evolved since the nation's transportation network was first envisioned. And we believe that with collaboration across the CAB program and you as leaders, we can be more strategic and nimble. And lastly, of course, a lot of these goals are advancing the state and regional goals to reduce climate change and make us a more resilient and healthy community. So one thing I just wanted to share with you all that is on the CAVEX website, and I'm just going to enter that into the chat box just here momentarily if you want to find some more information on your own. In July of this year, the Governor's Advisory Council and state leaders approved the state's 9 principles for policy when it comes to connected and automated vehicles. And I am not going to go in detail here today because we don't have time, but these are supposed to help guide our local and federal leaders to understand what policy is necessary when thinking about the future and these types of technologies. But I do want to direct my colleagues on the task force today to look at items 5 and 6, because we call out broadband specifically. And in fact, last week, Margaret Anderson Kelleher testified in front of Congress to note that transportation infrastructure is broadband infrastructure. And so we are very happy to be at the conversation today to talk about how we can collaborate and innovate together. So just a little bit about how our program here in the state is organized to set some context. I mentioned the Governor's Advisory Council, which sets the vision for this work, but the real work happens in our statewide CAG Innovation Alliance. So for anyone that is interested in joining, please copy my email and let me know. This is a vast network of over 200 technical experts across the region who are leveraging their expertise in 5 different committees, from safety, workforce, data, infrastructure, and outreach, to help us understand how the state needs to prepare in the near term and collaborate, because we know that state entities cannot do it alone. And really exciting for us, we over the past few years have convened what we call our ICAB interagency team, where all levels of the public sector in the state of Minnesota come together when a policy priority comes to fruition or is an urgent need. So a good example is 2 years ago, the freight industry came to us at the state and said, we need support to use connected and automated technologies for freight. And so with the help of ICAB and public stakeholders and policymakers, we were able to pass the region's first platooning bill, which is a bill that uses connected vehicle technologies to help trucks convoy together very closely to reduce driver fatigue and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And lastly, just a little bit, the foundation of all this work is the team. Similar to OVD and the amazing work of Diane, Angie, Sonia, and all of our colleagues, the CAVX team is a multidisciplinary team of 10 staff working from engineering in civil and electrical systems to law, which is my background. I'm a lawyer and have been supporting the Department of Transportation's Chief Counsel for the last 8 years before our program was founded. And then, of course, we have multidisciplinary experts in communications, partnership, contracting, procurement, and community development. So a little bit before we dive into this project, some of you might still be thinking, I've heard of CAD, but it's only in the media or in CBS or some of the local news stations. And so just to give us the same understanding of what connected and automated technologies are, we think about them in 4 key ways. Some folks who might have heard it called the ACES acronym. So for our program, we try to align work within the Department of Transportation to look at autonomous vehicle technologies, which is that future technology which is self-driving, where there's no human driver. But we also, though, more in the near term, look at connected vehicle technologies, which I'll talk a little bit more about, but these are actually deployed today. The third component, and my colleague here, Jessica O, who you heard join us, is from our sustainability office, is very important to these conversations because electric vehicle technologies are being built on a majority of these cab platforms. And so the industry is headed in the direction of making sure these technologies are sustainable. But the last component that's really important for us to understand too is that a lot of these technologies are being thought about in a multimodal shared platform. So similar to Uber and Lyft today, many of the industry and tech innovators are looking to develop technologies that can be shared by communities so that you have multiple uses for these technologies. Just for some additional background, which might help for the conversation later, autonomous vehicle technologies are quite honestly just a traditional vehicle that adds enormous amounts of sensors to the car and then is integrated by a very sophisticated central computer. A couple pieces of information that's relevant for a conversation on fiber and broadband is that these require enormous amounts of data sharing to and from the system, including other vehicles and infrastructure. And this is done through, most importantly, LiDAR, which is a set of sensors that goes on top and around the vehicle, which emits pulses of light out into the environment and then predicts the information back to the vehicle to help it understand, oh, there's a pedestrian that I need to miss, or, oh, that's a tree, or here's the curb or the lane marking. And this is also supported by geospatial systems and, of course, cameras all around these vehicles to help them detect objects and stay safe. Now, just so people have a further better understanding of this, today on the market, a lot of people think about self-driving vehicles as being fully autonomous. We are not there. In fact, a majority of the vehicles on the market are on the latter side of this screen. This is a series of automation levels that was developed by a global society of engineers to help us understand there are different levels of automation, and like any technology innovation, we're on a spectrum of innovation and we're not quite there yet. So on the left side of the screen, levels 0, 1, and 2 are lower levels of automation that you'll see in the market and on our roads, including Minnesota today, but they absolutely require a human driver to be in and behind the wheel and to be constantly monitoring the vehicle to avoid in unsafe situations. However, in Minnesota, we are testing level 4 technologies. In Rochester, Minnesota this month, in August, I welcome all of you to join us to the Med City Mover, where we're testing 2 autonomous driverless shuttles to understand how these could operate in an environment. And as you'll see at the top level of the spectrum, the future, very far out, are these level 5 technologies that do not have a human driver. But as you can imagine, these are actually not in existence because they cannot navigate rural roads, which is common in Minnesota, and they're unable to navigate different winter weather conditions. Just because I get this question quite often, I wanted to pause briefly and help us understand why we're talking about this. Mostly it's because we're still trying to plan for an unknown future. So recent Deloitte data surveyed government, public members, and then the industry to understand where we all think this technology is going to be deployed and when. And folks like me in government, 1 in 5 of us believe it might never happen. But in the off chance that it does happen the next 30 to 40 years, which is what some market industry researchers show, we absolutely need to plan and prepare for this future. And just briefly, and most importantly for this conversation, connected vehicle technologies are already being sold on the market by large manufacturers like Toyota and Ford, and these technology takes enormous amounts of data, like I mentioned, trying to talk to signals, so the vehicle can actually use a sensor that detects if a traffic signal, including 3 of the corridors in Minnesota that we built over the past 5 years, and allows the traffic signal to tell the car, hey, I'm about to turn green, or I'm about to turn red. It also helps detect red light running and helps detect objects around the vehicle, like people who are in wheelchairs or people who are biking, to help avoid collisions. But this data requires enormous networks of foundational fiber infrastructure so that we can have the backbone data for information going back and forth. And just as a reminder, even though we are going to talk a lot today about passenger vehicles, and the images I've shown today have been about passenger vehicles, we are thinking about this technology in Minnesota and globally in all kinds of markets. So automating commercial freight and traffic, automated personal delivery like the sidewalk drones you've seen advertised nationally. Buses are getting more and more automated, and even bicycle pedestrian applications are being automated so that we can detect where they are and make our communities safer. So that was CAV in about 5 minutes or less, and that was just a background to help us understand where we go from here. So the Minnesota mobility ecosystem, which is something we've been working to call this new ecosystem across the state, is very robust, and we're now one of the leading programs in the country. We have over 120 active research, deployment, and development projects with the team of engineers that I talked about earlier, as well as the 100+ partners that we work with on an annual basis. A lot of this work comes through the Minnesota Cab Challenge program, which I'll touch on, which is an innovative partnership program that leverages the $6 million in investment that my program is allocated each year to help leverage that into additional private investment, which sometimes we've seen over the last few years can either double or triple the state's investment rates. We have many, many partners and many programs throughout the state. You see a few of them highlighted on the screen, but as you can imagine, all of these programs and all of these projects require underlying background infrastructure like fiber and broadband to help us plan for the future, but it also serves an additional purpose, which we all know is connecting communities. One thing that I just wanted to share, as some of you might be familiar with, is all of the work I'm going to be talking today came through the Minnesota Cab Challenge Innovation RFP, which is an award-winning request for proposals for industry, researchers, and communities. In fact, anyone can propose an idea that leverages state funding each year and then develops public-private people, or P4 partnerships, to produce projects in the communities that support direct community requested needs. So an example of the Med City Mover project down in Rochester was actually an idea from community members from Destination Medical Center, the City of Rochester, and Mayo Clinic to understand how we can leverage connected and automated technologies to serve the community members of Mayo, which includes, of course, the renowned global institution Mayo Clinic. So another thing I just wanted to touch on briefly is that we are investing in some of these connected technologies already with some of our existing fiber networks along our state highway rights of way. So our Regional Transportation Management Center, or RTMC, navigates at least the Department of Transportation fiber network, and that helps build out, in as much as we can, and we'll talk about how we can do more of this in the future, different ways to integrate these technologies into the existing MnDOT system. So as you can imagine, we have 11,000 miles of roads in the state, and not even 1% of that is, or excuse me, 10% of that is covered by fiber. But what little fiber we do have is able to help us give road weather information to nearby motorists, to help them avoid snowplows or know when a snowplow is nearby. We use that for the dynamic message signs you might see on the roadways to alert you if there's a collision or something on the side of the road to avoid. And we also help our 511 system, which is what the RTMC or that management center uses to take in information from connected vehicles. We integrate it and make sure it's accurate data. And then that is the information that's spit back out into systems like Waze and Google Maps. So when you're actually using your Apple smartphone, it's information from our program that's helping inform you where you are and where you're headed and how long you have to wait, unfortunately. Another thing that helps us level set as I start to introduce this project in more detail is the CAF strategic plan. So as you know behind me, it's very hard for us to build a blueprint when the future is so unknown. But in the state of Minnesota, we were one of the first parts of the country to understand that before we should start thinking about research in this area, we should probably have a plan first in place. So the CAF strategic plan outlines 65 recommendations on how the state should plan and prepare for future technologies. And after 500 individual stakeholder meetings and 1,200 pieces of feedback, the #1 recommendation that we heard in 2018 was that Minnesota, you need to assess gaps in your fiber optic network. You need to work with the Broadband Task Force, and you need to develop a plan after some research to understand how you can grow that network collaboratively. And that's what I'm here to talk about today. So this news to you that I've talked about with my colleagues who are not experts in broadband like you all is an overview of the assumptions that we used for this public-private partnership study. And first and foremost is the fact that we know that gaps exist and that broadband is necessary to connect communities. We also know that 90% of the cost of fiber and broadband is during that initial construction phase, which quite often state DOTs pay for as they're building out roads and the road is already open, similar to the Dig Once policy. We also know that fiber and broadband is very valuable for our transportation system operations, fiber, the future of connected and automated vehicles. But for you all, we all know more importantly, broadband is important to connect communities and help advance some of the goals we've seen over the past 6 months with COVID and connecting schools and medical institutions. And so foundational assumptions for this project were that our highway rights of way pose a unique opportunity to leverage the public investment we've already made in acquiring that right of way and in building out projects, and that allows us to look for the future. So we started this project just about 1.5 years ago with the partners you see on the right, and I want to take a huge moment here to thank enormous amounts of time from Angie and Diane from DEED, as well as Jim Johnson and the CIO of Minute and their telecommunications team, who are enormous technical experts to help us complete this project with the recommendations you're about to hear. And as you can see the goals on the left, this wasn't just about a MnDOT project or a CAB project. However, my office was here to fund and facilitate these conversations so that we could start the conversation as an enterprise together as a state system and as community members to understand where we can go once the study is complete. So for those of you who just are visual learners, which is someone like me, we did to the communities through grants like we heard about, Diane talked about already. And below is just an overview of the process that we use today. So as I noted, just about 2 years ago, we formally kicked off this project. We started with a bunch of lawyers, including myself, doing a regulatory review of the state laws, including what challenges we might face if we wanted to do a public-private partnership, or what other regulatory and administrative challenges would exist. And then we started the long process of background research. That then culminated in some stakeholder interviews, and I'll share a little bit of takeaways in those interviews. And then we started building a GIS mapping tool, leveraging DEED data, Minute data, and DOT data, as well as confidential private industry data in a third-party tool that helped us understand where our own state gaps are and perhaps where private industry is headed. Then we validated some of that data with some MnDOT district offices. We have 8 district offices across the state who are already planning on how to connect the middle mile infrastructure. Then we shared that information back with industry, and today I'm about to share the findings with you. So one of the key items in the regulatory review is that we realized that even though the state of Minnesota has authorization in law for public-private partnerships, or P3s, it's somewhat limited and gray in how we could use and leverage this regulatory ability for a telecommunications public-private partnership. And so we have an opportunity to explore that further after our discussion today. We also found that there, in previous efforts to do this, so many of you, if you were around in these efforts in 1990, we tried a project called Connect Minnesota. And that gave us the opportunity to test out this idea. But because at that time we did not know about doing our financial due diligence, unfortunately the partner was unable to support the project and went bankrupt. And so we were left with a project that was unsuccessful. So from a regulation standpoint, we need to make sure we're doing that due diligence. We also understood and heard that the state, through Minnesota bartering law, MINIT has the ability to barter and develop relationships, as does DEED. But MnDOT has not been able to be a part of those conversations, and so we want to avoid some one-off approaches and siloed approaches to building these partnerships. We also recognize that even the state's utility accommodation laws need to be reviewed and updated. And so the Office of Broadband Development helped work with us and our land management staff to understand where some gaps are and how we can better inform industry where we're building out our utility policies in the future. Lastly, and most importantly, item 9. New USDOT guidance shows us that the Federal Highway Administration and Secretary Pete, as we call him, are very much supportive of efforts to financially and politically support broadband efforts. So a few of the comments we heard from some of the stakeholders to help inform this conversation is that MnDOT is excited to be a part of this conversation and at the table. And so while we are very good at experts in the technology and installing fiber in our rights of way, we need to do a better job coordinating with folks on this call and state offices like MINIT and DEED. MINIT reminded us that they already have fiber in some portions of the state along the highway rights of way, and we have the ability to lease that. And so we need to leverage that, but we also need to leverage the fact that MINIT has bartering authority and they have a requirement to coordinate with the 87 counties, which is very challenging to do, as you can imagine. DEED, we heard from Angie and Diane, and they reminded us that they have such strong relationships with the telecommunications providers in MINIT that MnDOT can be a part of that conversation, and perhaps we can even update our grants program to consider CAP as an element or review criteria. We heard from educational members, such as the Department of Education, that reminded us that community anchor institutions like schools are critical to this conversation. And while we did not in phase 1 of this project reach out to them yet, we believe it absolutely could be a part of phase 2. We also heard from other states. We learned from some industry leaders in Washington, Utah, Maryland, and Georgia, who are already doing projects we're about to propose. And Utah has already in the last year used a public-private partnership to install 1,000 miles of fiber at cost due to leveraging some of the private industry investment. And of course, we heard from Bernadine. So thank you, everyone. Bernadine was a wonderful representative of your task force and reminded us the continued focus on rural broadband and connectivity. And especially during the pandemic, we feel that we have an opportunity to collaborate on building this information out together. And we also agree that MnDOT needs to be at the table more often to be a part of these conversations. So that's a lot of talking. And hopefully I'm just about more than halfway done so we can dive into Q&A, because I want to talk to you a little bit about the findings that we found. So in order to do this, we understand it wasn't just a matter of using the geospatial information and tools that you already use in your grants development and border-to-border grants information through MnGeo. We felt it was important to integrate MnDOT data, any other data we could find from transportation, as well as unique third-party data from telecommunications and other private providers. The challenge in that, as you can imagine, is as a state government entity, once that data is shared with us, it becomes public information. And so we didn't want to disclose or have to disclose private vendor data on where they plan to build out. So that's why we hired a third party, Ernst & Young, to develop this tool for us using GIS's Esri tool, or Tableau, which is a visualizer. And with that, they were able to take all the information that many of you are already familiar with and review from our MnGeo and broadband data, but then we're able to confidentially incorporate the private industry's data to show us the visualization of opportunities for build out. And a couple of things that we did to make this visualizer important was we developed a layer, a visual of where the traffic volumes are. So from a transportation perspective, this helps us understand where the urgent need is as far as congestion or collisions. The second thing we did from MnDOT's perspective is we developed a visual layer that showed us where opportunities are to connect state-owned institutions like DNR offices or airports, or even assets like our traffic signals and dynamic message signs. But then we added on that third visual, which is that third-party confidential layer of where the industry is building now or where they already have infrastructure. So when you combine those layers together, you see the view, and this is a screenshot in front of you. And as you can imagine, this is just the introduction to the conversation to help us understand where we could be going. So after a year's worth of assessments, interviews, stakeholder conversations, meeting with different transportation experts, at least from the Minnesota Department of Transportation's perspective, we have several recommended corridors of where we believe we could partner or build out in the middle mile infrastructure to connect communities across Minnesota. And just for some level setting, the green on the screen, and again, these slides will be provided to you after the conversation today. The green on the screen is the highest levels of opportunity, but we understand that doesn't mean that connects every community. So what we try to do is showcase a few key corridors where MnDOT is interested in investing our own resources to see how we could leverage our own DOT investment with the work of Minute, DEED, the Broadband Task Force, or any public-private partnerships. So a few things I just want to call out here in this map, as you see written out on the screen, is that it's very likely that the major corridors for traffic are the ones that you can imagine the DOT wants to invest in. So connecting fiber and broadband along interstates like 35 and 90 from border to border and state to state, as well as some of the major highways like Highway 55 to central Minnesota, Highway 10 all the way to North Dakota, and of course connecting Mankato all the way down to Interstate 90. Now with that, we then went back to some of our transportation engineers and county stakeholders and asked, so if this is where the DOT were to go, what are some of the investment priorities? And if we had a wish list of everywhere that at least the DOT and transportation leaders could invest, what would that look like in cost? And so before I dive into those numbers, I just want to share a little bit about the different scenarios we developed out of this study. And as you can imagine, scenario A is a wish list. If we had the funding to invest in every single middle mile fiber corridor that could then be leveraged to connect last mile connections, that would be an enormous amount of investment, which I'll talk to you about in just a bit. But then we scaled that back a bit to say, okay, so if we have to be more strategic and limited in our funding, there's a scenario B where we have only top corridor priorities for the Department of Transportation. Then in scenario C, you'll see a little bit about our regional corridors, some of the corridors I just mentioned on the previous slides, such as major interstates and highways. Then as you see in items, scenarios D and E, these are investment scenarios where we're really not investing. We're trying to maintain current fiber assets, but the state has chosen not to make any continued investments in this area. So when you think about this first scenario, it's enormous. It's over almost 3,000 miles of fiber laid within the MnDOT trunk highway rights of way. But with just 2,500 miles of fiber laid, we can connect almost 1/3 of the state, we believe, due to that middle mile expansion. So this is an enormous investment. And just for some clarity, what we tried to do is strategically show the timeline and chronology of when we could do this. Because of course you can't immediately build out 2,000 miles of fiber. You have to do that more strategically, which is why you see that green, light green, and yellow. That's just our assumption of how we could time out these processes. But as you can see, it's not just MnDOT connecting our facilities during a dig once policy and large infrastructure projects. This allows us to connect other state facilities like airports, Department of National Resources offices, and even the 50 statewide radio locations, which are used for homeland security and other uses. Scenario B is where we took a step back and said, so if we can't fund everything, what should MnDOT at least prioritize? And this is where we said, well, if we could at least invest in 700 miles of fiber over the next 10 years, we can actually connect 1 in 10 Minnesotans with the number of miles traveled across the state. Again, enormous amounts of cost, benefit, return just for that investment over the next 10 years. But then again, we also recognize that we still might have to have limited funding scenarios because governments are always limited in funding, and we don't to date have approval for this funding for this type of project. So what we decided to do is come up with several unique highway corridors that we believe could serve some of at least the CAV, transportation safety, and other needs I talked about earlier, at least for the Department of Transportation. But again, these major interstates and highways could still connect those last mile connections and community anchor institutions. One of the benefits of this scenario is that if this is the only amount of funding we could get, what we could actually do is cover the most highly trafficked corridors first, and then start to think about the build out later. And of course, options D and E, I didn't put D on here, are really just to leverage our existing investments. So there's no additional funding from MnDOT or the state or our partners in this effort, but we could lease or barter, perhaps with Minute's authority, some additional rights to use their own Minute fiber along different highways such as Interstate 94. And just for some context, this image on the map is actually the original 1990 Connected Minnesota map, which is where this whole idea of public-private partnerships came about. So I'm in just my closing slides. So start to think about the questions, ideas, feedback, and critical, constructive ideas as I start to close. But this is the most significant slide and one that surprises many of us. And I do want to give a couple of points of feedback. So in scenario A, if we had that wish list, if we had that full build, our consultants through the visualizer and geospatial data and market sounding efforts have made the assumption that it would cost $400 million to complete this build in the next 10 years. Again, this is if MnDOT could fulfill every fiber need in its highway rights of way. But I want to talk about one major caveat here. And this is why it's so important to have stakeholders that are familiar with this work, because our consultant made the assumption that it costs $40,000 per mile to install fiber. And when we do it here at MnDOT, it's 1/4 that cost, $10,000. So as I'm about to show you in a few slides, our new assumptions moving forward, even though this is the information our consultant proposed, we have cut this number in 1/4. But as you can see, even with that investment, our consultants are presuming that in the other states that are doing similar work, we still see a rate of annual turn anywhere from up to $12 million to $57 million a year if we were to develop a public-private partnership in this space. And you see somewhat similar numbers on scenario B, again with the caveat that that $117 million is 4 times the original assumption that we are actually going with. Now, we started to incorporate this data into the statewide planning conversations. So for those of you that might be familiar with how the state transportation plans are developed, every 5 years, we're required by law in the legislature to develop the Minnesota Statewide Highway Investment Plan, also known as MNCHIP. And this helps us forecast where we need to be investing in the future. And based on everything I just told to you today over the last 30 minutes, we have chosen to recommend to our stakeholders and to the legislature, and this is preliminary information that is a first look for you all, we are recommending that over the next 20 years, we invest in $100 million to build out the fiber network in those corridors that we've proposed. And of course, as you can imagine, the goals are here on the screen that we believe with partnerships like the Broadband Task Force and Minute and other community stakeholders, we can systematically build out technology, improve system reliability, support a transportation system for tomorrow, which includes connected and automated vehicles, but also help us as a DOT better understand the rural broadband community needs. So as I conclude, and I'm just going to talk about some of the partnership approaches and then our final recommendations, and then I'll be complete. There's several different partnership approaches that different states have looked at, and several that we have examined and recommend or don't recommend for Minnesota for various reasons. So as you can imagine, a true public-private partnership is where the parties design, build, finance, operate, and maintain, also known as a DBFOM. And that is a very large agreement that few states have actually done, but states like Georgia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania have looked at it. This is a very strong opportunity, and the state of Michigan is actually coming to speak to our Governor's Advisory Council on this topic in September, so I'll put that plug in as I conclude. But even though this is a huge opportunity, some of the legal experts and state agencies believe that the state law on P3s would need to be updated to make our authority even clearer. Now, of course, some of you are already familiar with some of these subsequent recommendations, such as a design build project, which is MnDOT's bread and butter and very traditional way of doing business, except we've never tried it with a fiber-owned partnership. And an operating concession is what a lot of other states do, where we wouldn't make the initial investment, the DOT to install the fiber, but of course, a private developer could pay or provide services, or we discuss and partner and negotiate what those rights are. Now, a lot of states like Texas are using leases or licenses, which is another really strong model. However, after having internal discussions with the DOT, we felt this wasn't necessarily our favorite approach because we really like some of these larger public-private approaches. And similarly with resource sharing agreements, Minute already has bartering authority, so we didn't feel this is somewhere where we need to emphasize and focus our energies, and instead should really think about those P3 approaches. I also want to share a little bit about what the industry shared with us. And of course, these were confidential meetings that we didn't want to disclose any one individual telecom or vendor's preference, but they reminded us a couple things. And they said, you know what, MnDOT, you need to be much more clear in your goals. Like we've seen as results of this study, but we need more information if we were to answer to a request for information or partner with you in the state. 2 is we need better numbers on valuations. You can't just make broad assumptions like $400 million or $100 million. You need better data, and consultants can help do that. Some of them expressed that they want exclusive right-of-way access, but others said, you know, we'd be interested in taking a few key corridors and coordinating directly either with DEED or MnDOT or Minute on how we could partner together. But they did overwhelmingly recommend that in the next 3 to 6 months, the state should issue requests for information to ask industry, based on the corridors I talked about and in conversations today, where would you be willing to partner with state and what would you be willing to contribute in a partnership? So finally, recommendations. This is what we actually came here for. And like anything, as my husband reminds me, I love to really, really bury the lead. So here we go. These recommendations, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail, and you'll see slides you have them for your own uses, but they're really central around this topic that we need a fiber group that is a little bit more under the guide of the Broadband Task Force, that would have folks like Diane and Angie, myself, and Minute come together so we can have a more regular convening for technical experts at the state enterprise, as well as community and county advocates. We also know that we need more funding. That's not a new conversation for us. We believe we do need to update the state laws on public-private partnerships, but that we do need to pilot a public-private partnership to prove this concept can work. And last and foundationally, we know that we need to engage stakeholders more, and that was a gap in this report. So first and foremost, one of the recommendations was to start sharing this information with councils like yours. So this is the first time we're actually sharing these findings more broadly. And two, again, we want to formalize this recommendation with you all, and I love the discussion, is that we do believe we need to create a new entity, or at least a more formalized entity between Minute, DEED, and the DOT to make sure we can continue to do this work together. Third is, and that was actually item 3. Item 2 is with Jessica O's leadership, she's joined us the call today, MnDOT has now convened a new right-of-way commercialization working group, which helps us understand across our different divisions and programs and districts how we also need to collaborate internally at the DOT as well as an enterprise. We also felt that we need to do a better job understanding the relationship that DEED and Minute have with telecommunications and other industry providers. With respect to law, which is one of my favorite topics, we do feel strongly that we need to revisit, reimagine, or revise the state law to fully authorize public-private partnerships for a telecommunications partnership like this. We also felt that we could possibly update the state law on relocation reimbursement expenses, because if in fact we were going to pursue these partnerships, the state shouldn't have to be the one paying for every time they have to be relocated. But of course, that's an issue that needs to be discussed with our private partners. If that's the case, we would then need to update the MnDOT utility accommodation policy, which was a key factor to the group and stakeholder, because as we know, the utility engineer, Jim Zigman, is a key stakeholder in understanding how we navigate utility in our rights of way with the needs and desires and future efforts of the private industry. And with that, we'd have to review our own internal processes and how we review utility accommodations. We also believe that we would like to fully and formally request fiber investments for the districts. So MnDOT, through my office, is already funding very, very small projects, $1 million at a time, which can be several miles, maybe 40 miles. A good example is we've now closed the gap from St. Paul to the Mayo Clinic with 40 miles of fiber 2 years ago to make sure that that system is up and running and redundant if something should happen. We also, however, as we heard about RDOF already today, we know that there's a couple communities and providers in Minnesota that are leveraging that opportunity. So could we review those grant applications and see if MnDOT, DEED, and Minute could support those efforts in a more collaborative and strategic effort? We also feel there might be opportunities to incentivize some of the rural build-outs. If the state could put a little bit more money at the table with MnDOT's help or others' help, could we review the grant program process? And of course, we want to continue public stakeholder engagement. We did not do that as a part of phase 1 because we wanted to make sure that our state leadership, including you all, are comfortable with this discussion and these findings. So the last recommendations before I conclude with lessons learned is we do want to, with permission, if you will, from the Broadband Task Force, issue a request for interest and information from the industry in the next 3 to 6 months to understand with the pilot corridors we proposed, is anyone interested in partnering with Minnesota? And 2, then we would move forward with a partnership to prove that this concept can work. So we'd enter into the formal phase of negotiating what the contract and terms would look like and do some due diligence with some consultant or private sector partners. We also finally, within the MnDOT internal working group for this project, believe that we have an opportunity the next year to apply for build, raise, or other federal grant programs. Diane and OBD do a fantastic job of monitoring those programs, so we believe there's an opportunity to partner together. So with that, I'm going to conclude with next steps and allow us time for discussion. So this fall, I'm going to be sharing this information with you all, seeking your feedback, perhaps sharing it with the county engineers who are also involved in this work. And then we hope to next year issue this request for interest after discussion with you all and perhaps any additional changes needed to this project. And then perhaps discuss some broadband legislation to fully update the state law to make sure we can do this in accordance with our congressional and other federal leaders. So with that, I think I'm going to pause for a Q&A, and before I do that, I want to offer these questions to you all. I'm really curious if you're seeing any risks with our approach or the recommendations, if there's any major opportunities. What do you think is something we missed? I'm not an expert in your world, and I'm sure that we missed something that's key to the work that you all do. And I'd really like to hear from you if there's any interest in us partnering as a task force and state enterprise with DEED and DOT. And as I ask you to think about that, I'm going to share some of our lessons learned, because I know we didn't do this perfect, and it's really important for us to acknowledge where gaps were. One is that not all consultants are prepared to do this work. We really appreciate the work our former consultant poured into this, but as you saw, some of the assumptions were flawed, and it didn't quite get us the deliverable that we feel makes us the most prepared. So we know we have to revisit this in the future. We know we need to tap into the expertise of you all, DEED, and Minute. We do need to, in fact, re-review the regulatory challenges, because it's unclear whether or not we actually need to update the state P3 law, but many people felt we at least need to talk about it with the lawyers from different state agencies and local stakeholders. We also need to be comfortable taking risks. I was asked to help lead and found our state's CAV office because I'm a lawyer who's worked with industry in different areas of the private sector and have taken many, many calculated risks on government projects. And we believe this is a key opportunity to do that. But we also heard from industry, you need to make the business case clear. It's unclear today with the findings why we need to support this effort, at least from different stakeholders we've heard from. We also know that a lack of MnDOT coordinating with you all hinders some of our opportunities for advancement here. So that's why I'm here today. And we also believe we must take a phased approach. We can't eat the whole apple. We need to take a small bite like an RFI, or even just hearing from you to see how we can move forward together. So with that, I'm going to go back to the previous slide and share, and members, I'd be happy to hear comments, questions, and or feedback.
Kristen, this is Dave Wolf. I had a quick question for you. And is my microphone on right now?
It is, yes. Thanks, Dave.
Awesome. First off, thank you for this presentation. There's a lot of data there. You did a great job communicating the projects that you're looking at. You identified the armor towers earlier on in your presentation, or the digital communication radio towers that the state uses for emergency services and broadband. Most of those sites are already fed with fiber. Is part of your strategy to rebuild to each site with new fiber connections?
Great question, Dave. And I apologize if that's how it came across. One thing I probably needed to do a better job in talking about at the outset is this project looked not only at hard line fiber and conduit, but also in small cell infrastructure. So as you can imagine, those small cell, technologies are popping up across the country. And as someone who lives in Minneapolis, it's something that's really important to me to help communities when they might not have fiber, because fiber can't go everywhere. We know that. In addition, there are some challenges to how we navigate the small cell revolution, and that our transportation engineers are worried. So for example, in Minneapolis, at the end of my block in Longfellow, there is a light pole that has about 6 small cells on it, and it's starting to lean. So it's a safety issue for some communities because we don't have a general statewide policy in how we navigate that. So small cells are part of this interest when you talk about armor, as well as, and one thing that I didn't note that came up very late in the study is even new opportunities like SpaceX. SpaceX is using their new satellites and local servers and technologies to expand access to telecommunications in a very different and unique way. And they've actually approached our office to see if Broadband, DEED, Minute were interested in a partnership in that level too. So yes, you're absolutely right. This isn't just about fiber, it's about connecting communities in Minnesota through fiber, small cells, and even other innovations.
But to that point, with the small cells, most of those have fiber to them already too. Or are you talking about future small cells? I'm completely lost on where you're going with that.
So many of a good example is connected vehicle technologies use 5G and other cellular technology, and even cloud technologies and edge computing. Now, while edge would take a connection to fiber, some of these newer technologies might not actually take a hardline fiber approach. So what we were trying to understand is what is the state of the state with some of the technologies that are being innovated in the connected and automated vehicle world. So you're absolutely right. If an armor facility is already connected by fiber, you're right. We would not seek a partnership to add a redundant line of fiber to that. What we were trying to show is the vast map of opportunity, and that's why an RFI is so important, because if an industry member says, well, I want to connect to that, that's where we would come back and say, well, I appreciate your interest, but we actually already have the needs met here. That's what makes this really complex, because all of these different technologies have different needs in use cases.
Thank you, Kristen. I appreciate your time.
Hi, Kristen. This is Teresa Sunday. How are you? Thank you for this this presentation. It's very detailed. There's a lot to take in, and thank you for sharing it after the fact. My concern is the drastic reduction after a consultant said that it would cost this much, and then suddenly it's not going to cost that much at all. It's cut down like to a fourth. And how did they suddenly cut the cost, especially of fiber in these days when, you know, it's super expensive?
And Teresa, that's one of the biggest concerns, and frankly, why we did not publish the full study. So the only thing that we are publishing are slides like this and the one pager that I sent out, because unfortunately, we do believe, to your point, we're very concerned about the flawed assumptions that this particular consultant used. So that's why we are only able to use the information MnDOT has when we install fiber along the rights of way, which is on average $10,000 per mile. Now, of course, an average means that it could be more than that, it could be less than that. So that's the data that we have. And that's why I think it's very important that this is just preliminary data. It's not the full study. And that's why, as you saw the lessons learned, this particular consultant probably wasn't the most equipped to handle those types of questions. And so that's why you saw the drastic change in what they proposed as a general number, just in some of their other states they've worked with and other partnership opportunities versus what we've experienced here in Minnesota. And again, that experience, that $10,000 number, was only Minnesota DOT's experience.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, the consultants tend to sometimes put rosy glasses on things, so appreciate that. Thank you.
Hello,
Kristen, Paul.
Go ahead, Paul. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I saw a couple slides ago on the discussion, you had a reference there about small cells posing a challenge to right-of-way. I guess in this discussion about fiber, to me, we're mixing apples and oranges. I know you referenced, I would be really curious about that location in Minneapolis. You know, as someone whose company meets every week with the gentleman who approves the small cell permits in Minneapolis, I tend to think that there's probably something more than just small cells going on that pole. And you know, so, you know, we have a framework for deploying small cell in Minnesota. Legislation that was passed 4 years ago. So what are the challenges? I guess I didn't understand what the challenges are because of small cell.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that, Paul. There, you know, sometimes even if you have a statewide policy, that doesn't necessarily mean people always comply with policies and the utility accommodation laws. So one of the challenges our transportation engineers are saying is that we do need a better approach from MnDOT's perspective on how we manage as a DOT the navigation of small cells. So we might not be as sophisticated as the city of Minneapolis in how they oversee their small cell deployment policy. And I absolutely agree with you. These are two different types of technologies. However, I just wanted to clarify that for our study, we're trying to look at all the different future technologies that could support connected and automated vehicles, even if small cells isn't a focus of this particular broadband task force.
Yeah, and I'm not aware that anyone's even putting small cells on MnDOT property at this point. That's why I was curious about that. I mean, certainly we would welcome the opportunity to do some things in MnDOT right away, and those are different conversations with government, you know, than what we have in the local municipality. So, but I certainly wouldn't call it a regulatory hurdle by any means.
Absolutely, and that's why there's a difference between the state DOT policy and how we manage our rights of way versus how the locals are doing it, Paul. And that's why we wanted to have a discussion, because it can't just be a state and then a local perspective. We have to have some sort of critical integrated understanding of how we do this. And we do have engineering concerns, as I noted. People have been entering into the rights of way and installing some of these technologies without our knowledge, and that poses enormous challenges with how we navigate our safe rights of way and in other engineering challenges. But I don't want to go down that road. Happy to talk about that offline.
Right. Thank you.
Thanks, Kristen. I wanted to ask if you could say a few words to the task force about the the CIV project here in Grand Rapids underway and how that fits into your larger picture.
I would love to. So Bernadine noted that the Minnesota CAV office, CAVX, the X I didn't get to say stands for many of the unknowns, including how we navigate this new future, is working with local communities and how we can grow this technology into rural, urban, exurban, and of course, urban areas. Now, Bernadine brings up a fantastic opportunity with her home community with the leadership of Myrna Peterson, a member of our Governor's Advisory Council, and whom many of you know as a vast mobility advocate. And we are in negotiations, and I unfortunately cannot talk about the negotiations because we're still under contract and state law unfortunately prevents me from going into detail. But the City of Grand Rapids and an enormous amount of partners, including the Blandin Foundation, have approached MnDOT under the Minnesota CAP Challenge to deploy autonomous shuttles in their home community. And much of the goals of the Broadband Task Force, I believe, are being met by some of the work that's happening there. Bernadine, I would love to go into more detail. Maybe we can invite the Broadband Task Force to join us up there next year when we're fully launched.
Hi, Kristen. This is Mark Johnson in the task force. I'm sort of the education representative. I'm with a cooperative of school districts in East Central Minnesota. And thank you for your presentation. That was fascinating. I did get a chance to be on one of your focus groups when you were talking to education folks back a while back. And I have two questions quick. One, you mentioned E-rate a couple of times in terms of grants and funding opportunities. That always piques my interest because that's a schools and libraries and hospitals program. So I'm curious if you can say any more about your interest in that particular source. And then the second thing is, as we go into, as a task force, go into our development of our next report, is there anything specific that you have as an ask for us in a way to help you as we go into that report generation?
Well, I'll take the second one first. Thank you, Mark.
Okay.
And Mark, thank you again for your time as we developed this project. It was due to folks like you and Bernadine and others who participated in these conversations to help inform us about your expert thought leadership. With respect to the task force report, I first want to give credit that Diane and OBD and Angie did reach out to say, is there anything before we meet with the task force we could include in this year's report? And so if you might recall, there was a brief mention to this project, but it was before we had some of these initial findings concluded. So for the next report, I would love to work with the task force chair, any of you who would like to volunteer to see if any of these 14 recommendations, and I think I'll just move forward to show you the totality of them, could be included in the report. For us, and this is Kristen speaking on behalf of the CAVX office, I would love to see a few things, including a recommendation that we begin this more regular convening of the technical staffs between OBD, Minute, and CAVX and MnDOT staff. I think that's really important to understand what we don't understand, because we started to develop partnerships in my team that we realized, oh my goodness, Angie and Diane and the task force already have these relationships, so why are we doing this on our own? So that's one. Two is it would be lovely, of course, to seek more funding, even if for a proof of concept project, pilot project. I think in the future, we could leverage that into a more direct ask of the legislature about how we do these partnerships together. But third, I also think we should take a moment to review the regulatory challenges. So I think a recommendation would be to review that P3 law and ensure if it really isn't clear, and I would ask Deeds Council to look at it, if it's not clear from there in the task force perspective, we really should develop some language to make it clear that we can do this work moving forward. Now, with respect to your question about E-rates, I have to admit, I am not an expert in this, but some of my stakeholders and experts in local communities and in some of my national conversations, I lead several of the national CAV committees for the US DOT and state DOTs. They brought this up and said, well, Minnesota, if you're not looking at opportunities to use E-rates to integrate some of these findings and partnership opportunities, it would be a missed opportunity. So that's just something that we saw as an opportunity to put on this list for discussion with you all.
Thank you.
Hey, my name is Nolan Coughlin. I guess just out of curiosity, with the fiber that's kind of already laid in some of those corridors, was that something that you guys had done exclusively, or was there some sort of partnership that you guys already had for what's in place?
Yeah, great question, Nolan. So it came about in a couple ways. You saw me very briefly reference Connect Minnesota, and I'll see if I can go back to that slide. That was where we tried out this idea several years ago, way back in the 1990s. And that is where there was a partnership with a member of industry to help us lay this fiber outside of our normal state transportation investment plan. And so for those that may not be familiar, every 4 years we are required to develop a plan on how we build out the state highways. And in that plan is where we say, okay, here's the 100 or so construction projects on the highway each year we plan to do. And then, Nolan, to your question, in those projects we assess, is there an opportunity to add fiber? But I will say, because before this project we hadn't taken a holistic look at fiber, we hadn't been doing a fantastic job at digging once and building in fiber or conduit as we built those road projects. And now with the advent of these cab technologies and other opportunities like smart infrastructure and sustainable infrastructure, we realize we must be more strategic in adding fiber when we can. And so that would be a part of the bid item where we would say, okay, contractor who's going to bid on this project, we want to install this much fiber in this location. Of course, they would be bidding it, and that's how it would be part of the project.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Yeah, I know that dig once is definitely something everyone wants, and I think realistically it hardly ever happens because the more people you have involved, especially just off of sheer scheduling, availability of materials, especially with COVID right now, how the whole logistics chain is really screwed up because of manufacturing. But yeah, we run into a lot of conflict, at least from even what I see, just for simple locates on something like residence. I can't imagine that that's anywhere near better for something as large as a highway project.
Absolutely, and I can really empathize, Nolan. It's a big challenge. It is one that last fall the US DOT acknowledged yet again. They issued updated guidance under a new federal administrative rule to say, what can state DOTs do better to notify industry, either on an annual basis or even have more regular communications with the private industry on where we plan to be building projects. So I'm sure many of you probably don't regularly look at the STIP to understand each month what projects we're adding or taking away. So if there are opportunities that we can do a better job notifying, that's what MnDOT's here to learn how to do.
Well, again, thank you for your time and the presentation.
Okay, thank you, Kristen. Any last question for Kristen? Well, we appreciate taking the time to be here with us. Lots of good information, and I know you shared some of the material as well by email, so that's really good. You know, as far as the partnership, we very much look forward to that, and I think one of the subgroups will probably be reaching out to you to start to talk about, you know, kind of some of those recommendations. What does that look like, and then how we might even incorporate it into our final report for the year. So, so I thought that was really good, and there's some really interesting things in there. And from my perspective, the business case piece is a key one, right? So if we can, that's one of the things that we need to put in the report is like, okay, so we get broadband connectivity, so what, right? And if we can answer that so what, and it's compelling enough, that's how we get the funding designated for these types of things. So again, thank you, Kristen, for your time.
Thank you, everyone. And Steve, I know that we have to move on to the agenda, but if you'd like to use my email, I'm more than happy to answer your question offline. Teddy, everyone, thank you. I can't say how proud I am that we have a broadband task force with your vision leadership. So I just appreciate the time to be here today.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Okay, let's take a quick break, and then we'll pick back up. We're running a little bit behind, but I believe we can catch up. So it's 11:21 now.